You're listening to the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast, where we build healthier lifestyles, elevate your well-being, and transform lives. Welcome to BMI.
I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist and obesity medicine specialist. Thank you for joining me today on Beyond Measurements and Image. Welcome to this edition of the BMI podcast. Today, we're joined by Dr. Britt Morris, who's going to go through the dietary guidelines for America that were just released. And although that's a stark contrast to what we had, it's significant in that what we were doing, by all metrics, we could say is failing. I like the new guidelines, even though I know they're somewhat controversial. I think they're really rooted in solid science. The old guidelines, although may have been well-intentioned, through a host of various decisions over the years, led to really poor outcomes. And if you listen to the last episode, episode 41, I talked about the reason that the new guidelines were developed. And so I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that if you haven't heard that. Also, when we talk about the previous guidelines being erroneous and what their origins were, I would just reference you back to episode 14, which is titled, You're Being Lied to and Your Nutrition is Being Manipulated. Or episode 26, which was based on an article by Gary Taubes called What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie? And lastly, episode 28, When Politics Shapes Our Plates. All of these go in and talk about the origins of the decisions that were made that ultimately led to the food pyramid. And if you'll recall, the previous food pyramid was very heavy with carbohydrates at the base and very little protein and fat at the tip of the pyramid. And as Dr. Morris will explain to us here shortly, the food pyramid has literally been flipped, where the proteins and fats essentially form the base of the pyramid. And that's the foundation of which the new dietary recommendations are made. And again, the importance of that is when the government makes these recommendations, it permeates out into society. Now, we all have the ability to execute our own free will and make our choices. We can eat as much carbs as we want. We can drink a Route 44 Coke if we want. We can do all these things. In a democratic society, that's important that we have that free will. So then you say, well, why does the government even release guidelines? Well, it's important because all government-funded entities then have to follow the guidelines. So particularly the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutritional Program, we used to call it food stamps, the school lunch program, the prisoners, the vets, all of these programs that are federally funded have to follow the guidelines. So the fact that we are making changes to these don't necessarily affect your daily choices unless you want them to. But what's important is its verification of the data that's out there and the new way of thinking. And it's really, to be honest with you, it's not a new way of thinking. It's an older way of thinking that has just kind of come along. So with that being said, Dr. Morris, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Drew. I'm glad to be here. This is an interesting topic simply because the 2025 Dietary Guidelines for America is represented by this upside down pyramid, which is kind of interesting since we haven't used the food pyramid in a number of years. I think it was back in 2006 when we last used it. And the last several years, we've largely been using the food plate from the Obama administration as a representative for dietary instruction and dietary composition. But I do agree that there's certainly a emphasis and the slogan they continually use through the document that they've circulated to the public is that of eat real food. What it seems like they're saying is eat whole foods. And so they've got protein and saturated fats compromising the base of that pyramid, and then the refined grains and carbohydrates being of lesser importance than they once were. And the bottom line is, kind of go back to the old definition of what defines insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. And so a change in the world that we live in today, approximately 90% of Americans are considered metabolically unhealthy. We're fatter, we're sicker, and we're more unhealthy than we've ever been. And whatever we've done in the past is just not working. The question remains is who changes their diet based upon governmental guidelines? And maybe not many people do. But either way, the government's trying to make some recommendations here that would help us in trying to correct our metabolic dysfunction and our obesity epidemic that's developing at an alarming proportion.
Yeah, that's well said. And you're right. The old food pyramid is, in fact, I mean, it's very outdated in terms of data, but they haven't used it. Under the Obama administration, they did switch to the food plate. And just briefly, what that consisted of was probably about 25% of the plate was whole grains, which are good. And about 25% was recommended to have a healthy protein. And then the other 50% was fruits and vegetables, probably about 2/3 vegetables, 1/3 fruit. Although that's better than the old food pyramid, right? Instead of having, say, 50% of the diet coming from pastas and grains, they only had it down to about 25%. But the new recommendations are better. I think it's well said, and we'll go over a little more detail. They don't necessarily dial out specific percentages on any of the, macros, so to speak. But I think the overarching message, like you said, one, eat real food, which is eat whole food, minimally processed, right? Just as close to nature as it possibly could be. And then the other thing that is different from any of the previous is that they strongly recommend avoiding ultra-processed foods. In the previous guidelines that were released under the previous administration, there was no recommendation to avoid processed foods. That being said, I referenced the previous administration versus this administration. I want you to understand this is apolitical. And when you look back, dating all the way back to the 50s, and probably before, but in the 50s with the Ansel Keys study and Eisenhower's heart attack and everything that sort of has led up between then and 2026, there have been plenty of Democrat presidents and there have been plenty of Republican presidents, and every one of them has gotten it wrong. It's a bipartisan thing. Not to say that they got it all wrong. There were some good things that have come about, but it took both parties to get us in such bad shape. If you listen to episode 41, where we talk about the statistics, right, we know that nearly 70% of Americans are overweight or obese. We know the incidence of hypertension, hyperlipidemia, diabetes, they're sky high. 90% of people in this country die of chronic disease. Is it all related to diet? Well, of course not, but a huge part of it is. And like we talked about previously, our healthcare system is designed simply to manage sickness. It's not designed to prevent illness. These guidelines are a nod to prevention. It's just one tool in the toolbox that we have to gain a healthier lifestyle.
I agree, Drew. I think with regard to our current healthcare system in America, at least, we're very good at taking care of a broken leg or a gunshot wound or an acute injury or even an acute illness. Where we haven't been successful is in applying that model to chronic disease and or chronic disease prevention. Our current acute care model falls down in the face of that. And so this is definitely a nod in the direction of starting to make some changes where we can use food as medicine or food as a preventive measure for developing those diseases. Our incidence of heart disease continues to rise. Our incidence of diabetes, type 1 and type 2, continues to rise. Our incidence of hypertension, these chronic diseases, which we're able to treat a lot of the symptoms of, but we've never really developed effective protocols for prevention. And some of the non-traditional medical sources of information are starting to provide us with some information that food can be a source of not only assist in the disease management of these chronic processes, but also in the prevention of these chronic processes.
Yeah. It's interesting, when we talk about processed foods or ultra-processed foods, I think it's important to recognize that the typical American, particularly the typical American child, 70% of the calories consumed on a daily basis come from ultra-processed foods. So what are ultra-processed foods? Well, most foods are processed at some level. And anything that you do to alter it from its natural state is considered processed. So, canning it, packaging it, salting it, any of these things process it. But ultra-processed is where you just basically have modified the ingredient to the point that's essentially unrecognizable as that ingredient. And they do it, they add emulsifiers and color and stabilizers and preservatives, all probably with good intention, at least at some level, in that it, allows it to be stored for longer. It's more convenient. These things are beneficial in a busy life, but ultimately the price you pay is pretty substantial. Again, the overall message is just to eat food that's closer to its natural source. Dr. Morse mentioned the fact that, we are getting sicker as a society, but our healthcare system is really designed to manage acute care illness, whether it's medical or traumatic. And we've discussed that before as well. Treatment of chronic diseases is something that's maybe done more as an outpatient, and we're getting better at it, and we're getting even better at prevention. But one thing that's rarely talked about is the dietary component. And there's not a lot of studies that really go over this. In a recent journal article in the Journal of Gastroenterology that was published in December of 2025, they looked at whole food diet inducing remission in children and young adults with mild to moderate Crohn's disease. And so I looked over this article, and basically what they did was, we know that inflammatory bowel disease is an autoimmune disorder. And autoimmune disorder just means that your immune system doesn't recognize part of your body as you. So our immune system is designed to recognize self versus non-self. If the immune system doesn't recognize something as being part of me being Drew, if it doesn't recognize my colon as being part of Drew, it tries to reject it. So in like ulcerative colitis, it tries to reject the colon, which then causes this inflammatory bowel disease. Crohn's disease is a similar one that can affect the entire gut, colon, small bowel, stomach, up to the mouth. And there's a whole host of autoimmune disorders, but we know that autoimmune disorders are more prevalent in 2025 than they were in 1950. And it's thought that that's probably multifactorial, but a big part of that is diet and these ultra-processed foods. So in this article, they basically looked at kids ages like 6 to 25. So there was some young adults, and they all had Crohn's disease, and they put them on essentially a whole food diet versus what they call an exclusive enteral nutrition. And what that is a preformulated nutritional supplement that's one happens to be made by Nestle's Health Science. It's known that in Crohn's disease, there can be a dietary component that is well managed with this exclusive enteral nutrition. So they compared a whole food diet, what they called the tasty and healthy diet, to this exclusive enteral nutrition. And the study was very interesting. The study's endpoint was looking at tolerability. So it really wasn't necessarily looking at how it affected the Crohn's disease itself, but there were secondary endpoints, which were inflammatory markers were reduced, as well as symptom control. So those weren't the primary endpoints. So it's not a study that conclusively says that whole foods are better, but definitely it points in the direction of, one, tolerability, and two, the fact that food can affect it. And although it's not really necessarily considered a dietary related problem, it's an immune system problem, I think it's fair to extrapolate the concept that a lot of these foods that we're eating, these ultra-processed foods, likely are the source of the autoimmune disorder in the first place that then ultimately causes the rejection of whatever the body part is that it's struggling with. We know that autoimmune disorders and allergies are higher amongst children now than they were when we were younger. So again, back to the point that Dr. Morris was saying, the new food guidelines are a great first step to making some dietary modifications that can help us to move forward in terms of making better choices that can lead to healthier lifestyles. What do you think are the biggest changes that you see in the guidelines from either, My Food Plate or the previous guidelines?
Yeah, I think some of the biggest changes are the emphasis on red meat, healthy saturated animal fat. I think these are things that have been somewhat vilified, whether it be in previous renditions of the food recommendation, but this document seems to lean into those as healthy whole foods. These ultra-processed foods, as you stated earlier, are inflammatory in nature because of the processing that they went through to be created. There was a time in the following post-World War II where these food products were generated to try and feed portions of Europe that had been devastated by the war itself. They started to evolve in that setting. So they were originally well-intentioned, but now, as you stated, they make up, upwards of 70% of our daily caloric intake. That's especially noted in children, but also in adult populations as well. So these foods trigger a process that creates a great deal of inflammation in our body. They're high in sugar. They're high in unsaturated and saturated fats. They tend to create these autoimmune phenomenon that you're describing in the recent GI article. These foods they tend to disrupt our hunger hormones. And so they create a sense of fullness, but the satiety doesn't seem to last. And then they seem to be engineered to a point where just a couple of hours later, you're looking for something else to eat. And so it creates a problem with the content of the food products that you're consuming, and then the need to introduce more content in a very short period of time. So it becomes very difficult to restrict or minimize your portions and or your calories because of that content. So with this upside down food pyramid and the new dietary recommendations, there seems to be this emphasis on satiating protein, animal fats, such as full fat dairy, butter. And there's certainly, more current data that seems to indicate that these foods have been inappropriately vilified by previous recommendations regarding their consumption and intake. One of the confusing things with the current recommendations is that the image tends to recommend these animal-sourced proteins and fats, but then they still maintain a limit of them being your 10% of your daily caloric intake. And I've read some other articles and taken in some other information regarding this. That does create some confusion for some folks about how they go about meeting those guidelines. But I think that's one of the key takeaways. I think the second point that I'd make is that they directly address added sugars, and they particularly address that in the pediatric population. And I think that is our overdependence and, for lack of a better term, addiction to sugar, and comes largely from these ultra-processed food, sugary beverages. I think those are a big part of our problem. And I think this document is a good starting point to start to try to give people some guidelines, some reasonable guidelines to try to start taking some of these things out of our diet and making us healthy.
Yeah. So a couple things. You talk about, eating a high carb diet and the fact that it basically 2 hours later, you're hungry again. Right. So we've talked a little bit on the podcast before, when you eat, you take in those calories. So let's just say simple carbs, you drink a Coke, or you just have some of these ultra processed foods that are rich in sugar and relatively protein and fat light, right? So they're mostly carbs, high fructose corn syrup, a lot of salt, sugar. They're flavorful. You like to eat them. They're very satisfying to eat. So what happens is you eat those, and when you do, it gets into your stomach. It goes into the small bowel relatively quickly, and it's a liquid. By the time you've chewed it up, you swallow it, your stomach kind of grinds it into a paste, which then secretes it into the small bowel. And at that point, the small bowel villi, they absorb that food, and your pancreas responds by secreting insulin. And so then insulin rises because the blood sugar rises. So the insulin is there to drive sugar into the cells. And we've talked about this. When the insulin levels are high, that inhibits lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat, but it also promotes lipogenesis, which is the storage of fat. So that happens. So that in and of itself is bad. Now, if you're out walking or running or you're moving about and you take those carbohydrates in, the insulin goes up, it drives it into the cells are going to be able to utilize it relatively quickly. It's when you're just not doing anything. And so then what happens is after you eat, those insulin levels drop pretty quick. And not only are there probably chemicals in most of these ultra-processed foods that affect our hunger hormones, but those are called obesogens, but also just the drop in insulin level and the drop in blood sugar, that alone triggers your brain to want to go eat, right? So if you're diabetic and your blood sugar drops, or even if you're not diabetic and your blood sugar drops, if you're a caveman out there and your blood sugar dropped back in the caveman days, that was your body physiologically telling you need to go find some food. Well, that was a great survival mechanism when we were cavemen, but for the most part, we're not now. And so when that drops now and we're sitting on the couch, what it does is it tells us to get up and go to the pantry. That's not a survival mechanism, right? And so, but we do because we feel hungry, and then we go eat and we eat more, and we eat more of that same thing. So that's how carbohydrates work. Now, protein and fat, we know a couple things about that. Protein and fat, when you eat them, they move out of the stomach at a slower rate than carbohydrates do, and they're definitely absorbed at a slower rate, or at least the effects, right? The effects of blood sugar are attenuated. So you don't have these big rises in blood sugar with proteins and fats that you do with carbohydrates. And subsequently, you don't have as big a fall. So equate it to like an airplane, right? If you're flying at 36,000 feet, it's a long way down. But if you're flying at 3,000 feet, it's a much shorter way to hit the ground. So when you're eating fats and proteins, what we know is you tend to feel full quicker and for a longer period of time than with carbohydrates. And that then in turn doesn't cause that drop in insulin, which then in turn doesn't trigger this whole process. That alone, just switching from a big carbohydrate-based recommendation to a protein-based food pyramid or plate, I think switches things significantly. Would you agree with that?
I would totally agree. I mean, certainly the satiating process of eating saturated fats and proteins tends to diminish the need for multiple snacking episodes or events during the day. And all of these things have led us to the fact that roughly 70% of Americans are overweight, 40% are classified as obese. And this is part of the problem as we've gotten sicker, we've gotten heavier or fatter, and we've gotten more metabolically unhealthy than we ever have been in our history. And so I think these guidelines start to point us in a direction where we're moving away from these ultra-processed foods, which not only spike our insulin, as you alluded to, spike our blood sugars, as you alluded to, lead to diseases that are directly related to that, like type 1, type 2 diabetes. They also lead us to the autoimmune disorders that you previously alluded to, increase our risk of hypertension. They increase this generalized inflammatory state in our body that whole foods just don't produce. This chronic inflammation leads to destructive autoimmune phenomenon. Rheumatoid arthritis comes to mind. Type 1 diabetes comes to mind. Type 2 diabetes, although not considered autoimmune typically, is related to this spectrum of diseases. Hypertension, mental health disorders, anxiety, depression, and all of these things tend to lead us into a general state of generally unhealthy. And so it's a vicious cycle of obesity, not feeling well, depression mixed in with anxiety, and then chronic pain, chronic joint pain from the inflammatory processes that are contributed to these diets that are high in these ultra-processed foods. I think these guidelines, they're just that, they're guidelines. We don't want the government to tell us how to eat. We don't want the government to put an infrastructure in place and mandate how we eat. That's a step toward what someone might call socialism. What we do want is some basic guidelines to start giving us an idea of how we can live a more healthy life. I'm hopeful that these guidelines will at least get most Americans to start thinking about some changes that they can make along the line of trying to limit, if not eliminate, these ultra-processed foods that we take in and these sugared and sweetened beverages, these high fructose corn syrup, fruit juices, and things such as that create these conditions that lead to our ultimate destruction. Yeah.
So the guidelines, we won't get too granular on it, but they're summarized in just a few things. So let me just give you the sort of high level bullet points that come through, and then we'll just kind of go in briefly and talk about each one. So 1, eat the right amount for you. 2, prioritize protein. 3, consume dairy, full fat dairy. 4, eat fruits and vegetables throughout the day. 5, incorporate healthy fats. 6, focus on whole grains. 7, limit highly processed foods, added sugars, and refined carbohydrates. And lastly, limit alcoholic beverages. Let's just talk about each one of those. Eat the right amount for you. That's a great starting point. We've talked previously about the role of figuring out what your daily caloric needs are. And that's easier now than ever because you can just get online and you can put in, caloric requirements, and you put in your height and your weight and whether if you're male or female. And then you have to guess if you're minimally active, moderate, or very active, right? So that's where there's a little ballparking, but you click that and then it'll generate a number and say, this is how many calories you should eat a day. So that's super easy. So that's the first order of business. And I think, if you need help with that, you can download all sorts of apps. MyFitnessPal is one that we've talked about before. There's a free version, there's a paid version. And I've used the free version for years. I track my calories daily, just almost obsessively. And I don't do anything with it. I do zero with the information, but I track them. If I go over one day, it has no bearing on how much I eat the next day. I don't know. I just track them. So I would encourage you to do the same thing. Figure out what you're eating. If you're overweight, you're eating too many calories a day. And some people say, well, maybe I just don't exercise enough. But we've talked about that before on the podcast as well. It's hard to out-exercise a bad diet. I mean, you have to exercise so much. I'm a bit of an exercise freak. I run an insane amount, and I work out nearly daily. Even that, I don't think that would help check my weight. You just have to eat right. So that's the first one. The second one is prioritize protein at every meal, which is what Dr. Morse was talking about. They specifically talk about eggs, poultry, seafood, red meats. And then in terms of plant sourced, beans, peas, lentils, legumes, nuts, seeds, soy. And the recommendation here is about 0.5 gram per pound of weight. Now, we don't use the metric system in this country, so why they did it that way, I don't know. But you could do roughly 1 gram per pound of weight. Or if you take your weight and divide it by 2.2, that's how many kilograms you weigh. And then about 1 to 1.5 on that.
And that's a significant change from the previous recommendations, which were 0.8 grams per kilo on a daily. These current recommendations have increased that number significantly. Now, by most metrics as a population, we don't tend to be under-consuming protein. However, as we age, we need to be much more intentional about increasing our protein intake, simply due to losses from the aging process. And so this addresses two concerns by making proteins a bigger part of our daily caloric intake and by replacing those losses that we get through the aging process. And so I think that's a really significant change from the prior dietary recommendations to the ones that we're seeing here in 2026 now.
Yeah, that you're right. So consume dairy. So Britt, they recommend skim milk, 1% milk, 2% milk, because somewhere along the line, we've vilified fat, right? Which is all based from the Ansel Keys studies, and then it just went from there. Do you know how skim milk is made?
I believe they replaced that fat with sugars.
Yeah. They spin it down, right, like in a centrifuge, and they skim the fat off of it. So basically, you just have the juice, the milk juice, right? And then that's no good. Then they have to fortify it. So they put vitamin D and vitamin A and I think iron. They spin it down, take the good stuff off, and then put something else in. You know, the stuff that you took off, they have to replace that. So they replace it with something else, which is absolutely ridiculous. That's skim milk. 1% milk is you do that same thing and you take that milk juice, for lack of a better word, I don't know what it's actually called, and you add a little bit of whole milk into it until you have 1%. Or you add a little bit more until you have 2%. So that's an example of processing of food. So you're taking a whole food, the milk that came from the cow, and you're doing something to it, which makes no sense. And the government guidelines for years basically said you had to sell skim milk, 1%, 2%, whatever it was, in the school lunch program. So these kids weren't getting the benefit of that. So when you hear these guidelines reference full fat dairy, they're just talking about whole milk, real milk from a cow. Now, pasteurized, of course. Well, I say, of course, and not everybody even believes in that, but I do. So that's it. You know, so that's an example of a processed food, a whole food that's been processed, which makes no sense. None. But they recommend with the new guidelines that we consume full fat dairy, which I think is an excellent addition.
And Drew, all of this has been done in response to misleading scientific data from the past. We've demonized saturated fat as the direct cause of heart disease and other chronic disease entities, when in fact, we probably should have been vilifying sugar. We've selected fat as the culprit and then altered some of our good whole food sources to try to meet those preset criteria that we've created.
Right. And I don't think it was just serendipity. I'm sure the sugar lobby had a lot to do with that. Right. I mean, you take out fat and it tastes like shit. Yeah. Right. So you have to do something to make it palatable. And that something is add sugar.
Absolutely.
It's interesting because if you're a private industry and you do something, let's just say you go down this road, you're going to market a product and it's going to have fat in it. And let's say you think that's the right thing and you take it out. And then it tastes bad, and then you start dumping sugar into it, and you notice that your customers are, less healthy or whatever. If there's some level of responsibility, like you make a change, and that's what the government's doing here. But government is so slow to respond, right? So we had to have known over the last 75 years that the path that we were on is the wrong path. There is no doubt that every administration could see at least parts of this were inaccurate, but there was no change. You say, well, why would the politicians give a shit about that, right? But the reality of it is they give a shit about that because the food industry is funding those politicians. America is the best country in the world by far, but there are some flaws in our system. And one of them is our politicians don't always represent the best interests of their constituents. Oftentimes they fall under the influence of lobbyists. And that's not a knock on the great USA. This is the best country, right? And this is the best form of government. But that's one of the things. And so when you see these decisions being made over the years, it doesn't take long to trace it back to where it came from. It's always financial, right? And in previous podcasts, I've gone in and kind of highlighted some of that on both sides of the aisle. I think these guidelines are refreshing in that they are kind of flying in the face of the food industry, but I don't think they give a shit. I mean, I think they just recognize that this is what's best and they're going to go forward with it. Now, I don't know if you remember, but when Obama became president, Michelle Obama, she had a campaign that was strong against sugary drinks. Do you remember that?
I do.
Which was great. I mean, if you get sugary drinks out, especially young kids, you get it out of their schools. You go to school systems, they're sponsored by Coke and Pepsi and all this, and they sell that stuff there. She was on the right track, but somewhere along the line, the powers that be decided that, no, we don't really need to talk about that. We need to just move, right? So then her campaign become just move, right? Just, get some form of exercise, which again, kudos to her for trying to do something, but getting sugar out would do a whole lot more for weight management and all these chronic illness than moving. The combination's what's necessary. But the food industry plays a huge role in this, not only in manipulating the foods, right? But also the packaging. There's certain colors that are more appealing. That's how they're packaged, right? Even restaurants, I think oranges and reds increase hunger. So like you go to McDonald's or Burger King, they work at a neurologic level. And if you think that there's not something to neuromarketing, you're insane, right? We are all being manipulated. We can take that for the good, right? We can move that in the right direction. And I hope the podcast sort of serves that role, right? I mean, McDonald's and Taco Bell and everybody, they're still going to sell to you what they sell, but that's okay. We've just talked about always making the better choice, not necessarily the best choice, but just the better choice. If you're there and, you can get something that's a little better than the other option, that's the answer. So we've talked about, getting the right number of calories, prioritizing protein, the role of dairy and full fat dairy, fruits and vegetables throughout the day. Lots of colorful, nutrient-dense vegetables and fruits are what they recommend. On the old food plate, that portion was about 50% of the calories. That hasn't changed a whole lot, but also they recommend, frozen, dried, canned vegetables. Those are acceptable as well. Anything that's naturally occurring is going to be best. You got to watch the marketing on like fruit juices, right? Make sure you're getting real fruit juice, not just fruit flavored juice. And sometimes they'll say like, 100% fruit flavored. And if you're not paying attention, you're getting played.
Yeah, I think the fruit juices are, for the most part, detrimental to our health. I mean, even those that are marketed as natural fruit juice, I mean, they come with a great deal of sugar, fructose, and the benefit of eating that fruit in its natural state is lost because the fiber that comes along with eating that apple versus drinking that natural apple juice, that fiber that comes with eating that apple often offsets that glucose spike in our system. So it decreases that inflammatory response that our system may have to that sugar load. Whereas drinking that, we lose that. We drink those calories. We lose the benefit of that protective mechanism that fiber can sometimes supply.
Yeah, and they recommend on these guidelines, the official recommendation on fruits and vegetables is that you limit the consumption or dilute it with water.
Right. And I like that. I mean, as a type 1 diabetic, there was a time when I was consuming far too many fruit juices. And so part of the process I used to get those out of my system was I was struggling with going cold turkey, so to speak, from that. And so I diluted it. I often diluted it 1-to-1, 2-to-1, 3-to-1, whatever it took to lessen my glucose spike in my system. But once I kind of discovered the hack of eating the fruit in its natural state, so I use the example of an apple, because an apple has a good amount of fiber content to go with the sugar load that it delivers. That really helped me start to really get those juices out of my life because they caused such a significant spike in my blood sugar. But I did like in these guidelines how they specifically recommended that diluting process, because for somebody that's going to drink those calories, maybe a child, that's a good way to start to eliminate the sugar content from their diet.
Yeah. Fruits and vegetables, great. The thing to remember about fruits and vegetables is they're all carbohydrates, and they're better because they're not simple carbohydrates because they are tethered with fiber. So that is good. And they come with, antioxidants and minerals and nutrients. So there's a lot of benefit. But in their most natural state is the best way, right? I mean, if you're cooking them down, you're doing all these things, you're altering that. And so raw fruits and vegetables are best, but any fruits and vegetables are good. But they are essentially all carbohydrate. I mean, there's some protein in some, but for the most part. And like avocados have some fats, right? Yeah. But just think of fruits and vegetables globally as a carbohydrate when you're assessing your macronutrients.
Yeah. Some of the fruits are, relatively low on the glycemic index scale. Mm-hmm. But you're right. They're in their natural state, they're carbohydrates. Yeah.
Yeah. The next point is just incorporating healthy fats, right? Which I know is something that's kind of near and dear to your heart. Mm-hmm. And they've recommended 10% of the calories in this category is from saturated fat, right? Which is basically animal fat. Do you think 10% is a good number for that? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's consistent with some of the historical recommendations on similar documents that we're looking at now. It's also consistent with some of the historical recommendations on some of the medical studies in trying to link saturated fat to heart disease. But if you're following these guidelines, it's going to be difficult to keep that saturated fat under 10%.
So what do you think about that? I hear what you're saying. Right. If you follow these guidelines, that's going to be difficult.
Right.
I think that's okay.
I think that's okay. I think if we continue to move in this direction in another 5 years, that number will be higher.
So do you think that concept of keeping saturated fat consumption not to exceed 10%, do you think that was just a olive branch, like we really think this needs to be increased, but we're just going to start here? I know we don't know the answer to that, but there's the carnivore diet, which I don't know if that's 100% saturated fat, but there's a whole lot more than 10%.
Yeah, I think, an olive branch is a good analogy there. I mean, I think saturated fat, in some of the prescription ketogenic diets, they recommend saturated fats in the 70, 75%, 80% range. I'm not saying it needs to go there, but I think in the next rendition of this, if this current line of dietary thinking continues, we'll have more data in another 5 years. I think that 10% will be a higher number. I think it'll be maybe as high as 30% on that. But one of the things I think people need to know is that when saturated fat can become dangerous is when we're simultaneously eating a diet that's high in sugar and processed carbohydrates. That's when the saturated fats start to become dangerous, because then we've got saturated fats in our system and we've got high blood sugars and our pancreas is kicking out insulin. So we're developing a process of insulin resistance with a high dietary fat content. And in those situations, that fat can be dangerous in leading us down the road of cardiovascular disease and peripheral vascular disease. But I like the fact that they've moved saturated animal fats to a more prime spot in this upside down pyramid. And at the same time, they're addressing lowering our blood sugars and lowering our dietary sugar intake. And I think that can be a very healthy trade-off in the long run.
Yeah. Talking about the ridiculousness of taking whole milk. When we're talking about incorporating healthy fats, that's essentially meat, poultry, eggs, seafood, nuts, seeds. Again, full-fat dairy, olives, avocados, those are all healthy fats. And when you're cooking, it's recommended that you prioritize oils with essential fatty acids, particularly olive oil, maybe avocado oil. You can use butter or beef tallow and skimming it off and doing all that. But, the saturated fats, again, if you go back to caveman days, they would hunt a deer or a buffalo or whatever it is they'd, hunt, and they would take off the meat and cook it, right? And there was no process. That was a whole food that then in turn they ate. And there's a fair amount of saturated fats. But as humans, we've done this ridiculous thing, like the way we make Crisco oil, it's from cottonseed. Cotton's not even a vegetable. Like, that's called a vegetable oil, but that's not even a vegetable. And that was really just an old industrial byproduct. And so what they did was they had this industrial byproduct. They didn't know what to do. They essentially hydrogenated it, added hydrogen to it, whipped it up, made it this pretty white color, and sold it and told everybody, this is healthier than animal fats. This is healthier than butter. And again, what's the origin of it? Well, I don't know, but that was done by a company that made a profit off of that. And so was that the origin of it? It probably was. But in the end, I don't think saturated fats are near the villain that they have been made out to be. And I don't think animal fats, and if people want to be vegetarians and vegans, I mean, I think that's clearly their choice. But I know saturated fats aren't the problem that everybody thinks they are. That the correlation between serum cholesterol and dietary cholesterol are really as closely correlated as previously thought. I think that's it on healthy fats, unless you have anything else.
No.
Whole grains, focusing on whole grains. So as opposed to having the entire base of the food pyramid, or what they recommended initially as 6 to 11 servings of grains in the original food pyramid, now it just makes up the tip. It just makes up the very top. They really specify whole grains, meaning, you take a grain and you don't modify it. You don't take the husk off of it or the germ, right? You eat the entire grain. And so what that means is that you're really avoiding high processed foods like white breads, prepackaged breakfast options, tortillas, crackers. And the recommendation are 2 to 4 servings per day, not 6 to 11, 2 to 4 servings per day of whole grains. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a much more healthier option, certainly. I think it's also a more realistic option. I mean, for people that rely on those food sources as a source of calories. Again, it goes back to our metabolic health. I think a lot of these heavily processed grains contribute a lot to our problem with blood sugar, our epidemic of diabetes. They create a great deal of inflammation and autoimmune issues in our bodies. And I think reducing that by a significant percentage is a healthier move in the right direction.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Just to put a spotlight on sort of how controversial some of these guidelines are, we're just talking about whole grains. And these guidelines specifically say to reduce prepackaged breakfast cereals. I don't know if you're familiar with the Tufts University Food Compass. It's the most ridiculous thing. These are people well educated. I mean, that's at Tufts, right? That's a very prestigious university. They have this food compass. So what they did is they went and they looked at foods and they came up with these parameters, and then they basically assigned a number to them. And so the foods fell into like a green, which were foods that were to be encouraged, yellow, foods that were to be moderated, and then red, foods that were to be minimized. So we've talked on this, that, you should minimize prepackaged cereals, eggs, butter, animal fats are all encouraged. But you can see where the general public's going to get confused, because Tufts University, a prestigious university, they come out and their foods to be encouraged include frosted mini wheats, great grains, double pecan, whole grain cereal. They actually assign a number to these. So the frosted mini wheats, it had a number of 87. That was a food that was to be encouraged. Raisin Bran, to be encouraged, with a score of 72. Oh, here we go. How about cavemen loved honey bunches of oats? Yeah, that's what they loved. A score of 72. All of these prepackaged foods. And I think, I don't know, I don't want to say this definitively, but I can't help but think the food industry probably had a fair amount of influence in this study. But under food to be minimized, I'm sitting there looking at it right now. How about eggs fried in butter? The new criteria is saying you should eat eggs and butter, cheddar cheese, and ground beef. Those were all to be avoided, but they highly recommend honey bunches of oats and shredded honey wheat. I mean, it's just ridiculous. What do you do?
There's influence there. There's monetary influences there that food industry has worked its way into the medical research on nutrition. And so that in and of itself is such a conflict of interest. It's led to the detriment of our own self-interest. And I'm sure a lot of money has been made, but it is pervasive in the dietary community. Over the last several days since these guidelines came out, I've listened to several podcasts regarding varying opinions on these new guidelines. Some agreed with some of it, but didn't agree with portions of it. And some denigrated it and really didn't agree with it at all. But there were people with education in dietary and nutrition that were reported experts in the dietary and nutrition fields that felt that processed foods were unfairly demonized. That with the exception of some processed meats and sugared drinks, otherwise ultra-processed foods had some health benefits, including, as they stated, in the reduction of diabetes and the reduction of heart disease and chronic conditions like high blood pressure. It also seemed that there were some loud voices that felt that it was unrealistic to try to limit our sugar intake. In particular, they felt it was unrealistic to try to limit the exposure in children to sugary products. So the Tough study is representative, unfortunately, to part of the community in dietary and nutritional recommendations in that they've been heavily influenced.
Indoctrinated almost.
Yeah, absolutely, by the food industry. And that's unfortunate. And that's a battle we're going to have to continue to fight if we want to regain health.
Right. It does make you wonder, these highly educated people, like we talked earlier, it would be nice if you have an opinion on this kind of stuff that you post a picture of yourself or maybe yourself and the ones that you're responsible for, the children you're responsible for. Let's see what they look like in terms of health, and I'm not being judgmental. I mean, I know that sounds extremely judgmental, but I'm just saying, like, we know that overweight and obesity leads to all these chronic conditions. We've talked about it ad nauseum on this podcast, right? We know that. We know that for a fact. That's not an opinion. And so we know that there are different things that we can do. So these people come out and they say these things. And it's not that I think that I don't think they're being manipulated by the government. I don't think they even necessarily realize what they're saying, but they're not critically thinking. They're not looking and saying, gosh, this is what we're being told, but these are the outcomes that we're seeing. Maybe something's different, right? They're so pigeonholed into the way they think and I don't know, I want to speak for them, but clearly they got it wrong.
Absolutely. And this is just an accurate observation of just some comments from probably 8 to 10 dietitians whose information I consumed over the last several days. They specifically reference the MyPlate-based recommendations from the Obama administration and how they thought it was a simple process that was easy for them to teach to others. And that may be the case. I don't deny that. But what is definitely the case is that we're sicker now metabolically than we ever have been. So clearly, whatever that process represented and however they're teaching it is not working. And so because we're getting worse, not better, but worse. And so their pushback seemed to be, I don't know if it came from a personal political stance or if it was from the way they truly felt about these dietary recommendations, was that process was simpler and easier, and they're going to continue to use that to teach or, as you put, indoctrinate their constituents. And it just seems counterintuitive given the fact that nobody is denying the fact that we're fatter, we're sicker, we're more metabolic unhealthy today than we ever have been at any point in history.
Right. And the MyPlate, it's worth noting, the MyPlate recommendation is about 75% carbs.
Yeah.
Really. I mean, because 50% fruits and vegetables on one side and about 25% whole grains on the other side of the plate. So in total, about 75%. Well, I think the most important thing of these dietary guidelines come on this section where we talk about limited, highly processed foods, added sugars, and refined carbohydrates. So I'm just going to read something from the guidelines themselves. I think it says it best. Avoid highly processed, packaged, prepared, ready to eat, or other foods that are salty or sweet, such as chips, cookies, and candy that have sugars and sodium. Instead, prioritize nutrient-dense foods and home-prepared meals. When dining out, choose nutrient-dense options. That statement alone, if nothing else came out of this entire thing, that statement alone is good. Now, what gets done with that, that's difficult to know, but we have to minimize the ultra-processed food calories. And this is a good first step.
I couldn't agree more. I think the wording in that statement that I really liked was almost a statement of encouraging prepare your meals at home. Number one, it's more cost effective, and you know exactly what you're eating and what you're getting. You know exactly how it was prepared, how it was handled. There's no ambiguity there. In my own health journey, that's been one of the biggest learning points or weapons that I've used in my favor is, preparing about 95% of my meals that I take at home, that I prepare myself. I know exactly what I'm cooking my food in, exactly what I'm cooking, what I'm seasoning it with, how I'm preparing it. And I think it's healthier that way. And it's certainly far more cost effective to do that.
Yeah, for sure. And then with this limiting highly processed foods, they talk about limiting sugar. And so we've talked about on a food panel, there's, the recommended daily allowance of everything, vitamin A, vitamin K, carbohydrates, proteins. But the one exception to that is there's not a recommended daily amount of sugar. And these guidelines, they basically just said that any single meal should not have more than 10 grams of added sugar. When you're looking at nutrients, if a package has a food panel, right? If you're eating something that has a food panel on it, you're eating a processed food, and you're probably better off not to eat one. But if you do, if you're trying to figure out if it has added sugar, because it may not say, it should say total sugars and it should say the amount of added sugars. So if you can just minimize the added sugars, you've gone a long way. But they go in and basically say that, when you're looking at the food panel, look for words that include sugar, syrup, or into the letters OSE. So for example, high fructose corn syrup, agave syrup, corn syrup, rice syrup, glucose, dextrose, sucrose, cane sugar, beet sugar, maltose, fructose, fruit juice concentrate, honey, molasses, and then non-nutritive sweeteners such as aspartame, sucralose, saccharin, xylitol. These are all sugars in essence. The last four are non-nutritive sugars, but you really want to minimize at least the added sugars if you can minimize all sugars. But, remember that fruits and vegetables, fruits have a lot of fructose in it. There's a lot of naturally occurring foods that have sugars. Dr. Morse and I don't necessarily agree on this completely, but I think naturally occurring sugars are okay for my diet. He's a no sugar guy and he's in incredible shape for it, right? But like anything, moderation, right? Somewhere between him and I is probably the right spot. Maybe no added sugar might be a fair medium ground, or at least be aware of it and limit it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, as a type 1 diabetic, I go to great lengths to eliminate sugar from my diet. Even the foods such as carbohydrates that I take in that are converted to sugar ultimately, I limit those significantly as well. But I have a chronic autoimmune condition called type 1 diabetes that for my well-being and for my health, I feel like I need to do that. Does that mean everybody needs to eat that way? Of course not. But certainly this document starts to take some steps in putting that in writing and making the public aware that this sugar, it's not a nutrient that's essential that we need. It is, by and large, can become very harmful and certainly can be addictive. And unfortunately, some of the food industry has used that against us and used that as a way of continuing our use and abuse of that substance, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. And they've used power, influence, and money to do that. Unfortunately, that's made us sicker today than we ever have been.
We talked about how the guidelines coming from the government will influence the SNAP program and the school lunch program, as well as, like what we feed our vets and our soldiers. And it doesn't necessarily affect us day to day other than it gives us a good guidelines. But we talked about, and I don't know the answer to this, since these are the government recommendations, it'll be interesting to see if universities that get funding from the Department of Education, if then they are going to be tethered to teaching this. Because I know currently from talking with a couple of students in a dietetics program that the old guidelines were what were taught. And is that because those were the official government guidelines? Is it because that's what they truly believed? Or is there funding tethered to it? And I don't know the answer to that. But hopefully by rolling these guidelines out and beginning to build on these, we can begin to influence the next generation. And hopefully this isn't just viewed as a political statement, because there's so many things that are anti-Trump. And like we've talked about before, we don't want this to be a political podcast at all. But the reality of it is these guidelines came from the Trump administration. So I think they're solid guidelines. I think they're very solid. I just hope that the next administration doesn't try to reverse these just based on the fact of who implemented them in the first place, right? Because I think if we look at the science, we can see that this truly is on the right track. Are they perfect? Of course, they're not perfect. And there's going to be a lot of manipulation of them and improvement, and there'll probably be some setbacks over the years. But this is a good place to start. And I think if we can start teaching this, we can really start to make a difference, because we have to do something different. Because not only do these guidelines affect the SNAP benefits in the school lunch program, but then those people get sick. And so then the government has not only paid essentially for those meals, but then those people get sick, and then we got to pay for their health care, which is fine. I mean, it's America, but let's get them healthier so that maybe they are more productive. The kids coming through the school lunch can learn all of these steps so that when they're productive citizens, they know how to eat and they can avoid some of these health consequences that we've found ourselves caught up in.
Absolutely. I think these are a step in the right direction. I think if we continue to move in this direction, they'll be like a living document. They'll morph, they'll change. And I think the one thing I hope people will start to do as there's been so much emphasis on leading a healthier life, is I hope people will start to become more responsible individually. The government can't live our lives for us. We don't want the government mandating these types of decisions. But it is reasonable that a government put forth a set of guidelines that we may be able to take some individual responsibility, educate ourselves, and start to pursue these. And I feel in that light that they are a very reasonable set of guidelines that I think can get us headed from a health perspective in the right direction.
I agree. Well, Dr. Morris, thanks for going over these guidelines with us. I think this is a great place to stop. But man, it's a pleasure having you on and going over and getting your insight into this. That's all we have for the BMI podcast today. Thanks for joining. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. Join me next week as we go beyond measurements and image to build healthier lifestyles and elevate your well-being on the BMI podcast. See you then.